This video is more of like a personal anecdote sort of story about why I ditched Sony for Fujifilm. I'm not trying to convince anybody that that's the smart thing to do or that's what you should do. I was pursuing sort of a filmmaking / video production career that has more or less kind of stalled out, or that I've kind of given up on, at least for the time being. I bought the A7S III intending for it to be sort of my main workhorse camera a couple years ago, sort of just at the time that a lot of my video production gigs sort of dried up. I wasn't able to use the camera, or I didn't end up using the camera to the extent that I thought I would for professional work. I did work on a couple of cool projects with it, but nowhere near like I thought I would, and it ended up becoming a very expensive YouTube camera. It's an amazing camera, and I think it's kind of legendary in terms of a hybrid, mostly video camera, and it was painful to sell it. Earlier this year, I think in February, I found a used XH2S locally, and I had been interested in the XH2S for a while. It seemed like a really cool and powerful video camera, blazing fast sensor, kind of similar to the A7S III, and I thought I could get it and make content comparing it to the FX30. Anyway, things changed for me quite suddenly and unanticipatedly, is that a word? And I didn't ever end up making that series of content. So this is going to be my first video and hopefully a series of videos. So I had this very expensive new camera and didn't really have the opportunity to make a lot of the content that I wanted to make, but I ended up getting really interested in it despite a lot of its quirks and a lot of the difficulties that I've had and kind of continue to have with it. Something about Fujifilm intrigued me. So I ended up selling the FX30 and eventually, just recently, sold my A7S III. So now I don't have any more Sony cameras, and I now have the XH2S and the X-T5, which I'm using to film this video. So why did I switch from Sony to Fujifilm? It really has more to do with a lot of the intangible aspects of these cameras. There's something unique about them. They're kind of quirky. They're kind of interesting. I like the physical nature, the tactility of the system, and how Fujifilm is really sort of pushing that as an integral part of the appeal of its platform. Fujifilm was obviously leveraging its history as an imaging company, in particular in film, putting that history into its digital cameras, you know, with all the film simulations, with the XT, the X Pro, the X100 series being very vintagey and sort of analog feeling cameras in particular. So all of that I think is just kind of fun. There's something fun about it. Sony is kind of the opposite. Their cameras are extremely capable, extremely powerful. I think they lead the industry sort of in technology. They develop the sensors for just about every other manufacturer. Not every manufacturer, but lots of manufacturers basically just buy Sony sensors. But there's also something a little boring and maybe not as exciting about them. The thing I can't stress enough is I'm now more or less just a hobbyist. If I were relying on my cameras to make money, to get jobs, to make work for clients, and if you want my opinion about it, I think Sony is hands down objectively the better platform to own, to be a part of, for video in particular. It's way more reliable. The autofocus is insanely good, and I think if you're not leveraging autofocus these days with how good it can be on Sony in particular, probably Canon too, you're kind of missing out. Or you're not taking advantage of the platform to its fullest. Especially if you're just sort of like a run and gun solo operator and you've got to do so many things, taking advantage of autofocus is kind of a no-brainer. For content creators, especially if you're making money doing content for YouTube or whatever platform it is, Sony cameras are just way better than Fujifilm. And I'll kind of get into some of the problems with Fujifilm when it comes to being a video camera and kind of a content creator camera. I probably haven't done a good enough job really explaining what it is about Fujifilm that attracted me enough to basically switch over to it entirely, at least for the time being. Because there's really no pressure, it was more about sort of like the newness of the system I found exciting, just a change. I have been shooting Sony cameras for such a long time, and it kind of stems also from last summer I rented the XS20 to compare against the A6700. That was really my first sort of in-depth experience with a Fujifilm camera. I wouldn't say that I loved the XS20 itself. I thought it was a great little camera and offered a lot of really cool features, but what I did love about it is The ability to shoot in like 6.2K, the ability to shoot open gate, and the ability to dial down the noise reduction settings. I just felt like the image, there was something more organic about the image in comparison to the a6700, and probably in comparison to like all of the Sony Alpha cameras and like the lower end FX cameras. And since I'm not focused so much on videography outside of just making random YouTube videos every once in a while, I've been much more focused on photography. I just really enjoy the Fujifilm system for photography, like especially the XT camera. I really like the dial life on this camera. I haven't mastered it by any means. There's something more intentional about manipulating the camera settings with these dials, as opposed to relying on the PASM system, like whether that's aperture priority typically or even shutter priority. And I still rely on that system with the XH2S, which I primarily use when I'm shooting or photographing birds and wildlife, hobby style. For photography, I also really like the film simulations. Even though I typically shoot RAW plus JPEG or plus HIF files, I usually use the RAW photos, but having all of the film simulations as options to sort of preview and select from when you are editing the RAW photos, I think is really cool. Going back to that idea of Fujifilm really leveraging its history as an imaging company, I think that those film simulations are legit, and they do give a unique and characterful look to the photographs. And they're not like overdone. The major one is autofocus. Sony's autofocus, starting with the a7S III essentially in 2020, and all their cameras since then have only gotten better and better. Their autofocus is just alien technology. It works so well and fails so infrequently and does a better job than I could ever do as a manual focus puller camera operator. It's insane. It's just so good. And Fujifilm's autofocus seemed to have started to improve, started to get more reliable, and is something that content creators could use, and even solo, videographers or videographers part of a small team. You could maybe start getting there with Fujifilm. However, with all of these updates, firmware updates that they've been pushing out, the autofocus seems to be getting worse. Their lenses, the XF lenses made by Fujifilm, do not perform well for video at all, which is super disappointing because they're beautiful freaking lenses. Optically, I love Fujifilm's lenses, but as a video shooter, they make no sense whatsoever to invest in. Their apertures typically do not open smoothly, they open in steps. So even though all their lenses have aperture rings, they don't have declicking options like Sony's lenses do, the ones that have aperture rings anyways, because you can't smoothly open the aperture on Fujifilm's lenses. Not only does the aperture open in discrete steps, but oftentimes their lenses focus in discrete steps. Some do and some don't. The 33mm tends to have a pretty smooth transition in focus, whether it's autofocus or manual focus, but this 56mm, this is the new version, has a completely discrete stepping focus transition, whether that's auto or manual. So you really cannot use this lens to pull focus in a shot for video. The other problem is that their lenses just aren't consistent. Some operate one way, some operate another way, so you really couldn't have like a lineup of Fujinon XF mount lenses for video. They just don't, there's no consistency. Another cool feature of Sony's lenses is that most of them have a focus hold button, or it's a button that can be programmed to any number of things. And I actually like having it as a focus hold button because one thing that you might run into is if you're using autofocus to focus on a person in the shot, and if that person leaves the frame or moves, the camera will focus on something else. And you might not want it to. You might want it to hold focus wherever that person was. So that focus hold button is super easy to just engage that to keep the camera focused where it was. Can't do that on Fujifilm. Overheating is another potential problem with cameras, but Sony has overheating problems as well. But aside from overheating, I've also found that Fuji's cameras are sort of unreliable. I was out shooting with the XH2S just yesterday morning. Wasn't super hot out. The camera just started freezing. and it did it like 3 times. And I've had weird problems with the X-T5 where I'd be taking photographs and the photos would be just almost black, just like completely underexposed. And it wasn't a setting that I messed up in the camera. It just seemed to be a glitch, and I just had to turn the camera off. I took the lens off, put it back on, turn the camera back on, and then it was working fine. After a few years of owning the a7S III, it did start, there was a couple times where it would lock up on me, but I've only had this camera for less than a year, although it was used, so I don't really know what its history is, but that X-T5 is essentially brand new, and they just seem to have some operational instability that it took the a7S III about 3 years before it started becoming a little finicky, essentially. And the last big problem I'll mention in terms of shooting video is they have the same exposure tools that you'll typically find on Sony. Basically, you get a zebra and you get a histogram. The histogram is nice on Fujifilm. You can select an RGB histogram, just gives you a little bit more information. But the zebras are nowhere near as flexible. So on Sony, you can set 2 zebra values. So you could potentially have a zebra to monitor your highlights to see whether they're clipping or how much they're clipping. And then you could set a separate zebra for skin tones or maybe middle gray. On Fujifilm, you only get 1 zebra to set. And they also do not have the ability to go low enough to monitor middle gray in F-Log or F-Log2. So it's a pretty long list of reasons why I think if you're getting paid to shoot video, whether that's for clients or whether that's for your own content, I think Sony makes way more sense as a platform to invest in than Fujifilm. If you are a filmmaker who is sort of old school and insists on shooting manual lenses, then I think, hey, like there's a lot of advantages that Fujifilm offers that Sony doesn't. So let's get into those real quick. So if you want to pair this with manual focusing lenses, I think this is a really cool video platform. The things that Fujifilm offers for video that Sony doesn't is basically the full capability of that sensor. Whatever sensor they have in there, if it's a 6K sensor, 8K sensor, whatever, you can typically shoot in higher resolutions. Sony, regardless of how high resolution the sensor is, really only give you 4K and 1080p. Fujifilm, like the X-H2S, shoots 6.2K, and you can shoot in open gate, meaning that you can shoot the full height of the sensor. Sony doesn't allow you to do that. The X-T5, it's got that 40 megapixel sensor. You can shoot in 6.2K as well, although it's cropping, but I think that has more to do with like the heat limitations of that body. If you're shooting the X-H2 with that same sensor, you can actually shoot in 8K. Basically, Fujifilm will allow you to utilize the sensor to the capabilities of the body. There also is internal ProRes recording in a lot of their cameras, and there's way more codec, bitrate, just way more recording options in the Fujifilm system than there is in Sony. There are also settings to change the amount of noise reduction that's implied internally by the camera. And this to me is one of the big limitations of Sony as like a serious sort of filmmaking camera. I think it makes Sony's awesome for videography, but I think there's limitations when it comes to using their sort of consumer, prosumer level cameras when it comes to like making films. You can get around like those noise reduction issues that you might find by using an external recorder, but in order to turn off or turn down noise reduction in camera, you have to get like an FX6 level camera and above. I'd love to know what you think and what your experiences are, especially if you do shoot video and make money from it. Like what platform are you using and why? And if you are using Fujifilm, like what do you think about it as a platform for shooting video?